the Speaker, I can tell you that both initiatives will deliver more than what that last government attempted to when, for instance, they put out a $1 billion infrastructure scheme.
Tēnā koutou, I'm Selwyn Manning and welcome to A View from Afar. And today we are joined as always by political scientist Paul Buchanan. And we will do a deep dive today into how 2021 has witnessed a Cold War II styled standoff between global powers. And significantly, there has been allegations of a global scale hack by the People's Republic of China. There's the Pegasus spyware scandal, where Israel has exported deep tracking and targeting spyware to despots and authoritarian governments around the world. There has been also the relatively silent mission creep of Palantir as a Western-orientated, kind of a public-private partnership-styled signals facilitator. Now, Paul and I will discuss how all of this sets 2021 apart and adds up to the evolution of hybrid warfare capabilities. So, to discuss all this and more, let's cross to Paul Buchanan, who is waiting to discuss all this with us online right now. Good afternoon, Paul.
Kia ora, Selwyn. How are you doing?
Yeah, kia ora to you too. I'm going very well. Ka pai, thank you, Paul. And Paul, can you take us through all of this? In the first instance, like we know, a couple of weeks ago, it was revealed by nations all around the world that they had picked up that the People's Republic of China and various groups from within that state had been targeting and hacking on a massive scale. And we also, as we said in the intro, there's Pegasus, the Israel spyware creation that has been set up by a company under its jurisdiction and exported for profit around the world. And of course, there's Palantir. There's many, many legs to this, Paul. So over to you. Can you help make sense of all of this for us?
I think what we should do is we'll start with the Chinese hack of what was it, Microsoft Explorer. Anyway, the email system. We've known for a while now that the Russians, their signals intelligence agencies, work hand in glove with Russian organized crime. And they do so for mutual benefit. The criminals get profits, let's say by ransoming, holding people hostage. Let's say the oil pipeline in the United States. That was held hostage until they paid, I think, $4 million. They get the money, but the Russians get the technological knowledge that the criminals have developed. You see, some of these criminal organizations are actually ahead of state signals agencies when it comes to things like cyber hacking. So the Russians have been doing this for a while. They're suspected, a Russian criminal organization, is suspected of hacking into the computer systems of the Waikato DHB, the health board. And so they've been doing this. The Chinese, on the other hand, have always done the traditional thing, which is to focus their signals espionage on specific targets, military, diplomatic, economic, for reasons of state. And in this instance, with the Microsoft vulnerability, what apparently happened was once Microsoft announced that it had a patch, about a month after the vulnerability was discovered, someone in the Chinese command and control of cyber warfare shared that information on the vulnerabilities with criminal organizations based in China.
And was that the tip? Was that the trigger that provided more forensic evidence to the Western aligned nations in a security sense that China was involved? That this basically opening the trap door, if you like, that decision that doing that particular act then exposed the People's Republic. Is that how you understand that?
Yeah. Now I'll say something about that in a second. The way to think about it, though, is that what China was doing previously was akin to, let's say, jewelry thieves going in at night, breaking into a mall, and only targeting high-end jewelry stores. But then on their way out, they share the keys to the mall with a mob, and the mob runs in and ransacks everything. That was a line, that was a step too far as Western intelligence agencies were concerned. And it violated a major principle of signals espionage, which is you don't leave any fingerprints. You don't have what they call the return to sender problem. The criminal organizations were loose with their cybersecurity, so they were easily traced. And so then you had a united Western response, not just the Five Eyes partners, but countries, well, the EU as an organization,
Yep.
Countries like Japan, all repudiated the Chinese. So what may have happened is that someone in China, but below the leadership ranks, decided to do this as a rogue act. And I suggest that only because the response of the Chinese to the pushback from the West has been very muted. Normally, they would react very strongly.
Exactly, like we can see, particularly through the latter part of last year, 2020, through to the early part of 2021, China's response to Australia, for example, was very, very forthright and commanding for its own reasons. Obviously, Australia and the United States are much closer together than some of the other countries. But remember, the New Zealand spoke out independently in its own right, in tandem with all of these other Western nations, criticising the People's Republic of China for this act, stating it too had evidence that it was responsible for this. It was saying that, basically it was the strongest worded statement that New Zealand has made against the People's Republic of China since the Free Trade Agreement. I think is fair to define it in that way. Now, China's response to New Zealand was basically, don't get tied up in this Cold War type of dialogue that is clearly polarised and clearly not in anyone's interests. But we've had nothing since, have we? Nothing really firm compared once again to Australia, where first off, Australia was obviously annoying the PRC. It then sanctions and bans the imports of barley, and then Australian wines, Australian meat, ratchets up the seriousness by degrees as it gets more concerned. So we've seen what you're alluding to there, Paul. It seems like you're saying that traditionally within a single party state, a communist state, you get the leadership from the top commanding such serious things as this, and it will go down the chain, bang, it's orchestrated, the top leadership deals with the consequences afterwards. But this is different. Why is it different, do you think?
Well, again, it was very irresponsible and it was unprofessional because they were easily traced. I mean, what was remarkable is not only that New Zealand joined its Five Eyes partners and others in this common denunciation, but the head of the New Zealand Signals Agency, the GCSB, he came out and said that there have been about 250 cyber attacks on New Zealand targets during the course of this year, some of which were the Microsoft vulnerability attacks, and he attributed 80% of the attacks to the Chinese, named them by name.
By name, and many people, particularly in New Zealand, have been critical of the GCSB, our signals intelligence agency here, that is charged with protecting New Zealand's infrastructure, significant infrastructure, from cyber attacks. We see the stock exchange last year. We see the Waikato District Health Board, big public entity for the big area just south of Auckland City's area, for example. And the criticisms are, well, were they asleep at the job? They didn't protect in these cases. But with those kind of numbers you're bringing there, maybe it is a case that, many in the spy agencies often say we get criticised for the odd thing that they get wrong, but the many things that they correct or prevent go unseen. Do you think that that's the case and that's a fair comment, or are they still they should be critically examined for their performance and such things?
Well, they're certainly improving. I mean, New Zealand was the weak link in the Five Eyes chain. up until the beginning of this decade, and they've improved, but they are always playing catch up. I'll say two things: one about the Chinese, and then about how the response of the West. The Chinese, one of the concerns is that when state actors start working with organized crime in cyberspace, although their interests may overlap, they're not synonymous. Crime is is a rogue actor. They have interests of their own, and so you sort of have the tiger by the tail when you start working with organized crime as a state entity. They may turn on you at any moment. Now, admittedly, the state gives organized crime immunity. It gives them protection in exchange for whatever favors can be received. But let's just say that relationship is potentially fraught, and state actors need to understand that. I think the Chinese Communist Party may, someone below the leadership rank may have allowed this to happen working on their own. I wouldn't want to be that person today. But the Chinese leadership understand that it was a step too far to, unleash this mob, if you will, on everybody else. And so I think that explains the fact that they've been muted in their response. Now, with regards to the evidence, we have to remember that signals agencies, they adhere to something known as the dialectic of the offense and the defense. And that's a highfalutin way of saying that for every offensive maneuver, there is a defense erected against it, and then there's an offense to overcome that defense. That is as true for kinetic warfare, physical warfare, as it is for cyberspace. So the Five Eyes partners, the Israelis, any signals intelligence agency spends a lot of time playing defense. But let's remember, they can play offense, particularly the Five Eyes. And so China and Russia have to be aware of that. And I think that we've seen veiled threats from President Biden.
We'll get to that in a minute. Yeah.
Oh, good. Yeah. And so, he was basically implying, two can play this game.
Yeah,
and
he was,
so
definitely.
He was trying to remind...
Let's bring that up now, shall we, so that the audience can see that, Paul. We'll just bring it up on screen here, Joe Biden, and he's speaking. This is in the last 24 hours.
We're going to end up, if we end up in a war, a real shooting war with a major power, it's going to be as a consequence of a cyber breach of great consequence. And it's increasing exponentially, the capabilities. When I was with Mr. Putin, who has a real problem. He's sitting on top of an economy that has nuclear weapons and oil wells and nothing else. Nothing else. Their economy is what, the 8th smallest in the world now? Largest in the world? He knows he's in real trouble.
Yeah, so there you go. There you have it. This is real Cold War style type of discussions, isn't it? Now, United States President Joe Biden is actually, very much putting Vladimir Putin's Russian Federation into frame on this. But of course, we're talking also about the People's Republic of China in this respect. So let's look at the differences there. So the modus operandi, if you like, of the Russians was like you've described and detailed here. That the spy wing, if we want to put it in such crude terms, as the FSB in Russia has on contract and also on staff. Those that you would detail as cyber hackers, the illegal fraternity that's wrapped around that. They may come in and work on with the FSB on a particular project or target, then they're often in the wild again doing what black hat hackers do. That kind of methodology, that approach or modus operandi, in an interview I did about 2 years ago with Eugene Kaspersky of Kaspersky Lab, who based in Moscow. There is a software cybersecurity platform. He detailed that very much in specifics. That was the standard thing. He also said in brief here that Microsoft was the exploitable platform and code, basically because of its strategy of exporting its product around the world, namely that it had training programs all over the world where people would train up with the intricacies of Microsoft's internal code. You put that against the strategies that perhaps Apple and the Mac type code have worked on over the years. By comparison, there are very few people that really understand the coding that goes on underneath that. His view was that was the difference why Microsoft was so vulnerable, because they'd trained up millions of people around the world who couldn't get jobs, and they go feral. So that said, where is China with this, Paul? It seems like the illegal fraternity, if the allegations are accurate, and you're saying that there's forensics that have been able to establish this, and that's why the Western countries as a bloc have come out in the way they have. Where are the Chinese with this? Have they taken the lid off the Chinese criminal hackers, and they can't get it back on?
Oh, well, that's a really good question. It's unknown at this point if they can put that genie back into the bottle. I should point out that because we are going to talk about the West's use of proxies as well, the Chinese and the Russians turned to organized crime in order to develop economies of scale when it comes to cyberspace. They have their own dedicated hacking units, as does pretty much every Western country, and well, for that matter, any country with a modicum of technological capabilities. But by moving in and working hand in glove with organized crime, they not only get the benefits of the technologies and the know-how that criminals have developed well in advance of state actors, but they receive, again, the mutual benefits of being able to have a much wider, if you will, net with which to cast, thanks again to this association. That is very different than what the Five Eyes partners and other Western agencies have. And for this, we have to back up a little bit. Believe it or not, that the roots of this proxy warfare in cyberspace actually go back to the height of the neoliberal era in the 80s and 90s. And what happened then is that as the state was privatized around the world, under Thatcherism, Reaganomics, whatever you want to call it, there was a turn first to what became known as private military corporations, where the armed forces outsourced, in the beginning, logistical duties to contractors. That suffered mission creep, and it suffered it upwards in that eventually these private military contractors got into the security business and started moving up the kill chain closer and closer towards the pointy end. A case in point is Blackwater, the infamous Blackwater. So that happened in the 90s. Of course, we saw it in the Iraq War. We've seen it in Afghanistan. But many countries now have private military corporations working side by side with their armed forces.
And the intelligence and cyber intelligence is developed in the same...
That's where I'm going. In the last two decades or so, we've had the development of private intelligence corporations. Now, my consultancy is in part an open source intelligence consultancy. I have certain skills from government service and whatnot. I know where to look. I can offer them to clients. The most famous case is the outfit called Stratfor, which was developed by former CIA guys who retired and put their skills to good use in the private sector. That has become a very profitable business, and here is where Pegasus and the U.S. firm Palantir come into the picture.
Well, let's just on that point, I'll just bring in Palantir, and then we'll dig into Palantir, and then so the audience knows, then we'll expand out and we'll look at Pegasus in detail, because a lot of people will be wanting to dig down deep into that. But let's first off, Paul, let's have a look at what Palantir kind of puts out itself. And this is Palantir. I've got to say, this is Palantir's own promotional video. It's mostly visual weighted as opposed to dialogue or text, but it'll give you an idea. And many people, of course, in the audience will certainly know about Palantir. So, Paul, there's all the visuals, isn't there, on what it's promoting. Pick up there, this is one of the new products that Palantir is pushing out there in Power the Edge. What it's talking about there is the activation of artificial intelligence into all of those spaces, and it's saying that's global, and also hinting by the way of video that the space race, if you like, has taken on a new form, and that's to get AI into that space, empowering, as it says, decision-making, autonomous decision-making. So what that's talking about there, just to break that down in simple terms for the audience, is it is placing the autonomous decision-making in the hands of AI. So it's flagging out there that its work in that space is well and truly advanced, and putting it out into the corporate and government sector as to its newfound talents and market niche, if you want to put it that way. And I say that in a specific term, Paul, because that's where you were going with this, wasn't it? To pick up the private intelligence organisations or agencies and their expertise of what they have developed and are pushing to service their governments of their client base.
Yeah, and they're often, again, out in front of state agencies when it comes to technological development. And so whereas the Russians and the Chinese have to resort to partnerships with organized crime, in the West, what you have is these public-private associations where private intelligence firms, much like private military corporations, work with state intelligence agencies on a range of topics. One of the Palantir is interesting because it was developed by the CIA venture capital wing. Some people may not know, but the CIA has a venture capital wing, and they invest in a lot of things. Palantir is a joint venture between the CIA venture capital wing and Peter Thiel, the billionaire who was gifted New Zealand citizenship and is known for his association with Trump and other conservative Republican causes.
And many people all over the world, many in our audience will perhaps not even have realised, but they would have dealt in business terms with these individuals. PayPal, for example, was kicked off by Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, and many others that had a foresight, and many people have used PayPal to purchase goods and whatever. So the reach, I'm not saying that Peter Thiel is still involved in such things, but what I'm saying here is that, you know, the reach of these individuals that are in the top of their game in this space is quite colossal, isn't it?
Yeah, and Palantir has offices in all of the Five Eyes capitals. In fact, there's an office here in Wellington, but also in pretty much around the world in a Western-centric focus. Interestingly, to give you an idea of how they're in advance of state agencies, there was about 10 years ago, there was a bit of a scandal involving the Los Angeles police. And what it turns out is they had contracted with Palantir for some database searching technologies. And basically it worked like this. An officer on the beat would see a lowrider go by with a bunch of Mexican youth, and he would stop them for a moving violation. The rims were too shiny, or some bogus excuse. And the cop would turn his body camera on, and he'd walk up to the car and just look around. Those images were immediately sent back to a Palantir database, which then would algorithmically search through millions of files on individuals in the state of California. So the 14-year-old kid sitting in the back, if he wasn't on the database, he became part of the database. Now, of course, this is a gross infringement of one's civil rights, but it was being done by a private entity. And this is a key point here. These private intelligence agencies, and let's be honest, there are private intelligence agencies here in New Zealand.
Palantir's in New Zealand.
Palantir, but we have homegrown. I don't want to mention the name because
Oh,
I happen
yes,
to
yeah,
think
yeah.
they're an unsavory lot. But they operate on the margins of legality. They really play loose with the law much more than, for example, the GCSB.
Well, they're not exposed to oversight and regulation to the same degree as what their government counterparts are. So there's the loophole, isn't it, Paul?
And the regulations. The regulations for a private intelligence firm, I mean, first of all, you'd have to know a little bit about the intelligence business in order to regulate it. And, this is a little more than private eyes looking at, cheating husbands.
Yeah, and private eyes, just from the regulatory point of view, Paul is exactly right there. That's the framework of what the license basically comes through that frame, the regulatory frame.
Yeah. So, less people think that, the Chinese and Russians are all bad because they deal with organized crime. They have to, because they don't have the private sector working with them as closely as the private sector works with Western intelligence agencies. Now, I know the Russians.
That's where the connection comes. So they don't have that developed commercial kind of access that works hand in glove with government and private. So therefore, they are forced, if you like, to compete, go guerrilla, pull in the criminal elements, the black hat hackers, the ones that have the expertise and perhaps know how to get through systems. Is that it in a nutshell, Paul? That it's basically doing that.
Yeah, it is. So, I don't think that for me, being a pragmatist, it is what it is. The West plays offense and defense when it comes to cyber espionage. They do it using profit-oriented private intelligence partners. The Russians and the Chinese, they do it with organized crime based in their respective countries. It's the nature of the game. And how it's played depends on the circumstances surrounding the particular game in question. And so I don't think it's, a question of bad or good. It's just, what resources are at the disposal of these various states. So Palantir, just to finish with them, CIA creation, moved into the private sector, has mostly government clients, but including municipal governments, as the Los Angeles case indicates. And my understanding is they have some big corporate clients, but all of that is extremely hush-hush. I would imagine that the big corporate clients could be things like Boeing, people who develop drones and that sort of thing, because then you can put Palantir systems into these sophisticated technologies and get real-time mapping, data analysis, all that sort of stuff.
And if we were to understand what Palantir has been pushing out there in the last few months, like with respect to the drones, etc., AI, automated decision making, then that puts a whole new picture on the whole thing, doesn't it? You haven't got someone sitting in a container back in the western deserts of the United States controlling a drone over Middle East or North Africa territories. You've actually got AI sitting above somehow or interconnected that is making those decisions as programmed on the hoof, and that's a whole different kettle of fish, isn't it? Paul, there's a couple of questions I'd like to bring in here, just in speaking. First off, Kevin Hester brings in here, and he's asking, I'd be interested to know what both of you think of Peter Thiel. Remember, we've been talking about Palantir, his citizenship, and he was talking about here under the John Key governments, the national-led governments of over 4 years ago in New Zealand. Peter Thiel's citizenship was granted after after he spent only 12 days in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And Kevin makes the comment there, surely this shows a different criteria for billionaires with dubious histories. So we've detailed the history as we know with Peter Thiel, and that's on the face values. But getting to the main point, there seems to be two different types of criteria of citizenship for the ordinary person and citizenship in 12 days for others. That was under, once again, the John Key-led government, and obviously prior to COVID. Paul, do you think that this involvement, Peter Thiel's involvement with such big government, interaction with big government on behalf of Palantir and things like that, gave him the edge in being able to get around the world, develop himself, perhaps arguably a safe haven in New Zealand as a citizen?
Well, I know he has a bolt hole here. I should say that I got New Zealand citizenship after 20 years of residency here, and it took me a year and a half, and someone objected to my being granted citizenship, so I got to be interviewed by the SIS. Apparently, whoever complained thought I wasn't loyal enough to the Queen, being American-born, and so objected to me on those grounds. I say that because it was 20 years and a year and a half process to get citizenship. Now, there's always been a business category in which citizenships are expedited, a residency, then citizenship. When I arrived in the 90s, it was if a person brought $1 million in cash and put it in a New Zealand bank. Now the figure has gone up quite a bit. My understanding is that Thiel promised to pour $15 million, $20 million into a New Zealand-based data analytics firm. And in exchange for that, he got his quick citizenship. As it turns out,
12 days.
As it turns out, he only put $5 million into it, but then that data analytic firm went public, the stock prices soared, and Thiel cashed in with a very, very hefty profit on his $5 million investment. So I won't say he suckered the New Zealand government, but he's a savvy businessman, and he managed to get his citizenship and his bolt hole all in one fell swoop. But that business category is out there. So it's not just Thiel. I would hate to think of all the other billionaires, Russians, Chinese, Malaysians, who have been able to take advantage of that particular visa and citizenship clause in order to become Kiwis as well.
Okay, so let's just take a very quick break, transition break, and we'll come back and we'll dig deep into Pegasus, Paul, and other companies that are peddling such products around the world. Of spyware can be. I also note here that Edward Snowden had been interviewed by The Guardian as well, and I stress people that are interested in this Pegasus thing to look at The Guardian's series on this. Just put in your searches, Guardian Pegasus, and you'll see that. And there's a number of episodes that dig right down deep into it, and a salute to The Guardian for that. One of the interviewees there is Edward Snowden, of course, is well known as the whistleblower of all of this type of thing, going back about 3-4 years ago. Now, Edward Snowden is saying, Paul, that this Pegasus, like has been detailed here, is just one of many that are out there where private companies have developed this particular technologies and are selling it to whoever will pay the amounts for it. He says it's everywhere. So, Paul, can you once again, and thanks for this, tidy up, make sense of all of this for us?
Sure, as much as I can. On the technological front, this shouldn't be surprising. In an era where you have advances in telecommunications technologies, smartphones, smart TVs, those Alexa devices roaming your house, it was inevitable that this sort of spyware would be developed, combining artificial intelligence with good old-fashioned bugging. And so that part of it doesn't really surprise me. What's disturbing are two things. First of all, most of this was sold to non-democratic countries. And that's because non-democratic countries, authoritarian regimes, don't have the checks and balances, don't have the protections of privacy that liberal democracies, often have. So again, it should not be surprising, although coming from Israel, disappointing, that it's authoritarians who are using this spyware in the main. However, there are two disturbing aspects alongside that, which is not all of the countries that have contracted for the spyware are authoritarian. India is using the spyware and is using it against the government's opposition. And so we're starting to see in some democracies, let's say democracies with harder edges, the use of this very undemocratic technology to monitor dissidents and that sort of thing. And then the final
just on that point. Oh, sorry, just before the final, what we're picking up is obviously dissidents, activists, journalists, opposition politicians, everybody that seems to be lining up, for example, in some of these states that are the clients of Pegasus, are coming into frame, coming into scope, that are targets, that have had their whole life and interactions and everything laid bare to agencies that want to oppose their freedoms or their potential threats to that regime or authoritarian state. So sorry, Paul, to just interrupt, but I just wanted to capture that and make it very clear that it was a broad-based population of which comes into target, and there is evidence of that. So the argument, for example, that some may say that I don't do anything, I just go about my business, I'll go down to KFC and get my dinner tonight and I'll go and do this, and I never rock the boat, and that's not the issue here. That the very fabric of countries' rights, democratic countries in some respects is what you're talking about here, non-authoritarian, are having their choice of leadership or their choice of political expression denied them potentially by the state that wants to actually control it. And that might sound conspiracy theory territory 10 years ago, but it's not anymore, is it?
No, and I guess the question is whether this surveillance is targeted or is mass. In the authoritarian regimes, it appears that it's a mixture in that activists, opponents of the regime are targeted, but then their networks are also, exposed and all put into a database. And that would be interesting right there. Is the main database for all of the spyware in Israel? Are they facilitating, Saudis? There's all of that. And that gets to what I was going to say before, which is we've known for some time that some of these private intelligence companies, particularly those based in the Middle East and in the UAE in particular, employ former National Security Agency employees, GCSB employees, GCHQ. In other words, they employ former signals intelligence agents of various states to do their work. And that has prompted some governments, and I think the New Zealand government is one of them, although they won't confirm this fact, some governments prevent their spies from retiring and going to work in certain countries. I would imagine that any spy in New Zealand in the GCSB can go work for Palantir. But if they go to the UAE, that may be a problem for New Zealand because of the human rights record of the UAE. So what we're seeing is a migration of knowledge in the form of these people who were former state intelligence agents into these private sector firms. And at that point, all bets are off because they're not constrained by democratic rules. They're, in fact, in many cases, they're not constrained by the rule of law because the authoritarians that they're working for don't, obey the rule of law in many instances. And so we've got ourselves a nefarious project here that is only going to get larger unless there is an international agreement that these sort of private organizations engaging in these sort of intrusive, surveillance technologies either have to be banned or have to be heavily regulated across international borders. That's a big ask.
Yeah, this is kind of like the moves toward non-nuclear proliferation. The movements in various forms that took place in the 1980s and 1990s. When you put this cyber warfare thing against what Joe Biden was saying, and clearly we acknowledge very strongly that the United States leads the pack in being able to be effective in this cyber warfare strategy and its specific tactics, probably really ahead of the game, which is creating an arms race or a weapons race in some ways in this space, in particular around the world. But it shows you how sensitive and how real this is, where the President of the United States, one of the better ones, and certainly in the last 5 years, is saying that this arena is what will trigger a proper, I shouldn't say proper, a guns type war situation from developing. Now, this is the most serious thing. From the point of view of the technologies, some very serious and known people around the world that really specialize in the technologies, they're just warning the public too very much on how effective. For example, maybe I should bring it up. It explains it so much better than I do. Rene Ritchie, he's well known on YouTube. He's got a big following, and he is an Apple Mac guru, this guy. He understands the code. He's talking about Pegasus here, and I'll just run a short clip from his thing here.
Pegasus is military-grade spyware sold to nation-state governments and agencies, ostensibly to fight crime and terrorism at incredible expense, but reports say it's also being abused by authoritarian regimes and used against journalists and dissidents. It can be implanted onto iPhones and Android phones by targeted one-click social engineering attacks like spear phishing, or more recently, no-click payloads in messages, at which point it's just, spyware on. Now, Pegasus isn't known to have been used on phones registered on US cellular networks, though it may have been used on US citizens with phones registered on networks in other countries. Still, the vast majority of people watching this video right now simply aren't worth the time or expense required for it to be deployed against us. Sorry, but relatively speaking, we're just boring. Still, it is 100% absolutely positively worth being as informed as possible about Pegasus, because beyond just you or me, Pegasus might not only be a tool for law enforcement, but a weapon against privacy and freedom. Basically a James Bond movie as written by Edward Snowden.
There you go. So I just wanted to pull back in again, this element of the technology, just pulling back the technology, because this is at the forefront of everything, Paul. And no one says it better than Rene Ritchie, in my view. He understands it. And what specifically is important about this, and it was touched on in previous clip that we showed before, is that the assurances of security with respect to mobile devices in particular that we have assumed, the peer-to-peer thing like Signal, WhatsApp, and those that are using the iPhone thinking, well, wasn't there that case in the United States where a person who was accused of something, he had his data all locked away in the iPhone, and it took Supreme Court attention to see whether or not it should be unlocked or not, and Apple said, no, we're not going to unlock it, so they must be secure. These guys are saying, no, this is no longer secure. Everybody can assume that every device they use, irrespective of the branding of security, is out of the picture. It is spyware central, is affecting everybody now, should an authoritarian, or even, as Paul's pointed out, a democratic government like in India's case, if you're in scope, then assume you're being watched. So it's a whole different kettle of fish. Paul, with respect to the global powers, and then we'll get to the questions and comments that have come in during this conversation very soon. With respect to the global powers that are involved, and you made mention that there seems to be a need for some sort of global control, whether it comes out of a multilateral type of arrangement through the United Nations, or is it through bilateral kind of agreements. For example, Mike Smith makes comment with respect to Biden and Vladimir Putin after their bilateral. He is saying here, wasn't there a one-on-one to work together on cyber warfare, which he, meaning Putin, acknowledged was a problem for both countries. You know, it's this kind of thing we've seen in the nuclear space, these types of bilateral agreements, the SALT agreements, for example, et cetera, that have been around. Is it time? Can you just speak to that point a little bit more? Is it time for a serious push on some sort of controls relating to this?
Yeah, I think that these technologies are going to migrate into the mainstream. Remember, I talked about economies of scale earlier, and as countries develop the economies of scale to employ these technologies more and more, absent regulation, private firms are going to wind up using them. I mean, it's inevitable in my mind. What usually happens, let's say for example, with nuclear weapons, is at some point there's a mutual recognition on the part of contending parties that trying to get advantage over each other can only lead to war or disaster. And so it's born of that mutual recognition that countries come together and engage in arms limitation negotiations and that sort of thing. Now, perhaps the Russians feel that they've reached that point, that they know the United States can engage in offensive cyber warfare against them. They've obviously had, Russian criminal organizations engage in cyber warfare against the United States. And they can see where this could lead to, and that's what Biden was talking about. If, let's say, you suffer a crippling cyber attack against your power grid, and you have no means of retaliating in cyberspace, your only option is to engage an armed force against the actor that you believe is conducting those crippling attacks. So born of the recognition that the escalatory potential of cyber warfare, of this sort, may lead bilateral or multilateral negotiations on limiting surveillance technologies, hacking technologies, and the like. But I'll tell you, that day is still far off.
Yeah. Well, okay. Thank you for that. Let's look at some of the comments and questions that have come in. Here's one from Gray, and he says, it seems that New Zealand has condemned the Chinese. This is going back to the beginning of our program, the first section relating to New Zealand calling out in its own right China's efforts, should we say, alleged efforts of cyber hacking. And Gray says, it seems that New Zealand has condemned the Chinese with no reference to the wider programs. Is this good for New Zealand's independent credentials?
Well, I think that New Zealand joined its security partners for diplomatic reasons, but also because if the director of the GCSB is truthful, 80% of cyber attacks conducted on New Zealand targets emanate from China. And they appear to have the evidence, the cyber equivalent of a smoking gun. And so I think it's well within the rights of New Zealand to call out the Chinese if in fact all of that is true. Yes, it could affect the relationship between China and New Zealand. I don't really see it affecting New Zealand's independence, because in this instance, New Zealand's complaining about Chinese interference in our internal affairs. It just so happens that the Chinese interference, again, if we are to believe our government authorities, is part and parcel of a larger program directed at Western targets of various sorts. But we referred to the hacking that was going on here. Again, over 250 attacks in the year so far. And if 80% of those are coming from the Chinese, it was probably worthwhile, rebuking them for that.
Okay, and Liz, who's a very welcome commentator on the program very often and contributes in a very, very great and way. We leverage off your work a lot, Liz. So where is the evidence for the cyber attacks? That's the primary part of Liz's concern, because, as she says here, I'll continue reading, a lot of the accusations come from the United States, which has been sustaining an ongoing attack on China for years. I find it hard to know who to believe, as I don't exactly trust the US Pentagon war-making machine, which is increasing its $700 billion US annual spend specifically to deal with the threat of China. Personally, she says, I find this morally repugnant and bankrupt when there are so many other pressing issues which need taking care of in a COVID, climate change, homelessness, for starters, she says. So, Paul, this is a pertinent point. We addressed it in part right at the beginning about the evidence of this, of the activity of the People's Republic of China and the criminal elements of that used at such a time. So can you just respond to Liz here and say it how you see it from a point of view of evidential base?
Well, first of all, Liz, the Pentagon doesn't run the signals intelligence agencies. Those are separate budgets. I mean, I'm detecting a hint of anti-U.S. sentiment in your comment, and you're talking to a realist here. Okay, I'm pragmatic. States do what they have to do. Is the U.S. a warmongering country? Absolutely. But if you think the Chinese are benign, ask their neighbors about how benign the People's Republic is when it comes to international affairs. The hard fact is that cyber espionage is here to stay. It follows on a long history of signals espionage, dating back to when electricity was invented and then before. So yes, it is morally repugnant that any money is put into war and these sort of activities, but it's part of human nature. And unfortunately, I've spent a lot of time dealing with that part of human nature. Now, the accusations, what can I tell you, Liz? They're not going to tell us exactly how they know the Chinese are responsible for this, because that would let the Chinese know how they figured it out. Again, it's part of the game. And so I think what they've done, especially New Zealand, because it is so vulnerable to retaliation, that speaking frankly about these intrusions is as close as you're going to get. They're giving fair warning to the Chinese that they have evidence that the attacks came from them. That's remarkably undiplomatic language for anyone to use, especially intelligence officials. And the fact that the Chinese have reacted again in such a muted fashion tells me that the message has been received loud and clear. And I don't think we're going to see Chinese criminal organizations engaging in these sort of attacks in the future. I think this is going to be stopped right there by the Chinese because it's in their interest to do so. So, it's an ugly business, Liz, but someone's got to do it.
On that point, Paul, let's wrap it up for today, and thank you for your contribution and your company, Paul, on this particular issue. And we look forward to coming back to you again in 7 days' time. That is around midday on Thursday next week. That's New Zealand time, which equates to Wednesday around about 8 p.m. Eastern Daylight Saving Time in the United States on the eastern coast there. And that would be a Wednesday. Until that time, take care. I hope you found this a rewarding episode. We'll see you soon. Goodbye.